Now, uh, as I said in the second segment, where in the first segment where I left it earlier, it's not only that what happens in France in 1968. It would be reductive to think that it's only, France's youth somehow rebelling over the way that the authoritative, the conservative political system in France is managing uh, its affairs. Uh, the student radicals in 1968 are also influenced, as I mentioned in the first segment, the civil rights movement and the anti-war Vietnam War movement. But there are also other more progressive socialist, one would say, movements that influence student radicals in Paris and elsewhere. And this is the socialist revolutions in South America, especially Cuba, the new way that China under Mao sees itself in the world and sees the kind of um, as it were, the cause for socialism in the 60s. So Mao has a different uh, understanding of what the socialist world is, other than Stalin. We'll see that in a moment. And I mentioned the Franco-Algerian War that plays a key role in the student mobilization. It links up with the Vietnam anti-war, movements. The role of the global socialist revolutions, and the Cultural Revolution. That's what I meant earlier in China. Uh, Mao's Red Book, and those of you who have no clue what it is, I do urge you to look it up. It's an extremely interesting case here in point. The Little Red Book that Mao proclaims a new path to socialism through what he calls the Cultural Revolution, and we can discuss this in the tutorial, becomes one of the most printed books on the earth, with more than 1 billion copies printed. Indeed, this is part of Mao's program to induce the Chinese society to the principles of the Cultural Revolution, but at the same time, this brand of socialism that many people call Maoism is actually has an effect on student radicals in France and elsewhere. And what I have on the right here is an extract from a very influential film in France that kind of captures that moment of student radicalization, called La Chinoise, the Chinese. The film is by the now veteran filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard. It's published. It's a semi-documentary that is actually out in the cinemas in 1967, and it shows how student radicals and youth radicals at the time are influenced by the ideas stemming from China's path to socialism. Um, Now, there are two 68s in Europe. One is in Western Europe, and the other one is in Eastern Europe, and we'll see that a bit later. For now, I'll continue the story from Paris. So where we left it in segment one, we left it when we have student radicals, students effectively occupying the Paris Sorbonne University in 1968. They have demands that pertain to the way the French educational system is set up, but there are also wider demands about a nicer country, a nicer life, about workers' rights, about anti-racism, about anti-war. And these kinds of demands are being, as it were, endorsed by trade unions. And what happens in France, and that's the game changer, is that at some point there's an early on 68, there is a wide strike that's being proclaimed, with signals that the trade unions and the established political parties of the left endorse what the students are doing. This creates a massive political crisis. The government, de Gaulle, resigns. Now, the crisis in Europe, the revolts in Europe, do not only stay in Paris. Turin and Rome also become the epicenter of student discontent. The demands in Italy are also demands about university reform and workers' rights. And students and workers in Italy staged strikes from May 68 through to the autumn. In West Germany, another center of upheaval is Frankfurt, as I mentioned earlier. And here what we have is student radicalization of the sort that I spoke about, in France, but also a new generation of Germans openly discussing their recent past, the complicity that many in German society had against Nazism. And again, remember here, it's also a generation of Europeans' youth against their previous, it's also a revolutionary revolt of the youth of Europe against their parents, the generation of their parents. So it kind of makes sense that young German radicals, intellectuals will actually open the question of the complicity of their quote-unquote parents in the events that led to the Second World War. Now, someone might ask, as I mentioned earlier on in the first segment, France and other Western European states were prosperous, as I mentioned, right? It's a period of prosperity, 1950s and 1960s. Why then revolt? Someone here ought to mention that the working conditions across Europe at the time, even though we are at a time of economic growth, are not up to standards. And I really need to drive the point home here, as I mentioned, that in some Western European countries, like France, the revolt was also a revolution against the metropolitan aging elite who were in charge of the country's institutions. And just to give you a sense, that after 1968, well, Churchill here is an addition, but most importantly, what I want to say, and even Adenauer, that's the setup of the leaders that lead in Western Europe after the Second World War. Aging old men of a certain conviction. Obviously, Churchill gets out of the frame early on. Adenauer is still around, but obviously he's not a chancellor anymore. And most importantly, the symbol of the aging elite in Europe is Charles de Gaulle. And the 1968 revolts produced his collapse. And we also have a new generation, just to give flesh and bones to this new generation of radicals that I'm talking about. One is, the perceived figurehead of the Paris 1968 revolts, Danny Cohn-Bendit, a very interesting case because he's French and German and of Jewish descent, and he's someone who the French authorities during the height of the revolt deport to Germany. And there's a lot of discussion going on at the time, to do with his also Jewish, his Jewish origins, and there's a lot of latent anti-Semitism in the French political elite. Another radical who didn't live that long, Daniel Cohn-Bendit is still active in European politics, is Rudi Dutschke. He was sadly assassinated in 1979. A German radical. And another interesting case of a radical that played a key role in the Italian movements, and then he spent a lot of time in jail, being considered the mastermind of the Italian sort of terrorist organizations, is the philosopher Toni Negri. And here I would like to test this assessment of the 1968 revolts in Europe to you, because I find it a very interesting observation. And this is from the well-known historian Tony Judd in his book Post-War. Now, Judd argues that the Cultural Revolution of the era was remarkably parochial. If Western youth looked beyond their borders at all, it was to exotic lands whose image floated free of the irritating constraints of familiarity or information. Of alien cultures closer to home, the Western 60s knew little, he argues. When Rudi Dutschke, the German radical, paid a fraternal visit to Prague at the height of the Czech reform movement in the spring of 1968, local students were taken aback at Dutschke's insistence that pluralist democracy was the real enemy. For them, for the Czech students, pluralist democracy was the goal. Now, what Judd is gesturing to here, and this will be the continuation that where I'm going next in this lecture, is that what we have in Europe towards the end of the 60s is we have a Western European generation of youth that, in their attempt to formulate and express their discomfort of the state of affairs in Europe, they look to America, they look to the socialist world for examples, for models. But they don't really pay much attention into what's going on in the other part of Europe, the Europe that is under the socialist rule. And I'm going to go there now because 1968 revolts, counter movements, is not simply a story about Western Europe. It's also a story about Eastern Europe. And it is useful to bear in mind this cognitive dissonance that Judd talks about. For some Western European radicals, the problem is democracy. The problem is liberal democracy. The problem is capitalism. Well, for many Eastern European, student and radicals, the problem is not pluralist democracy. The aim is pluralist democracy. For them, the problem is communist authoritarianism. And so hence there is a, very interesting here distinction between, or rather cleavage between movements in the West, in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe that are claiming freedoms and freedom of expression, but they have different political aims. Now, in Eastern Europe, a key event that determines Eastern Europe's 1968 revolts unfolds, a key series of events rather, unfolds in the Czech Republic, in what is then known as Czechoslovakia, but also in Poland. In 1968 in Poland, we have student movements, strikes against the communist regime in March. The students demand free speech. Some Polish intellectuals defend the students. The authorities arrest the organizers of the protests and those defending them. And those arrested are disproportionately Jews. Again, like France, in a different setting, the Polish relationship with anti-Semitism, even after the Second World War, is an extremely complicated one. The Polish regime conflates its Jewish critics and the Zionist state, Israel, that's to say, and refers to some of its Jewish citizens as fifth column. And this is the Polish socialist regime. And in 1968-1969, 20,000 of the remaining 30,000 Polish Jews leave the country, and many migrate to Israel. So there are signs of discontent in Poland in 1968. And remember here, the precedent has been set in 1956 in the region, where there is a bloody occupation of the Russian army, of the Soviet army in Hungary, and they overthrow the regime of the socialist reformer Imre Nagy. And we've seen that earlier. I think it was in Lucius's presentation in the second week. Now, Warsaw and Poland is one pointer of the wider discontent that exists in the socialist bloc in the 1960s. Another one is Prague, Czechoslovakia. During the early 60s, Czechoslovakia is undergoing a relative liberal period of liberalization, And this is a belated echo of what happens after Stalin, where we have the so-called thaw, the moment of openness in to some extent of Russian society, designated by the ensuing leader Nikita Khrushchev. We'll see a bit of that in the lecture on the transition from socialism in Russia, but a bit later. In 1967, an intellectual opposition emerges in Czechoslovakia to Soviet rule. And this is also a period of economic stagnation for the Soviets and for Czechoslovakia. Students march against the electricity cuts in their residences. Their slogan, "More light," catches on, and more rallies demanding freedom and expression take place. Notice here the difference, right, between what happens in France, where we have different kinds of demands, and here the demand is more light. The Czechoslovak Communist Party responds to these events, by appointing new leaders and articulating reformist agendas. So in a nutshell, the local Communist Party in Czechoslovakia understands the need for reforms and more openness. And there is a shared mood in the country among students, writers, and party reformers that a third way is possible in Czechoslovakia, some kind of form of democratic socialism with respect for individual freedoms. And this is what goes on in Czechoslovakia and in the Czechoslovakian political discourse. However, the response from Moscow is decisive. Russian tanks evade Czechoslovakia. So the 1968 in Eastern Europe, signaled by the events in Prague, is a 1968 that effectively shows to the world that the Soviets, after 1956, it's the second big occupation of that sort, will not allow a country like Czechoslovakia to, as it were, enact liberal reforms. So days and follow the invasion, where we have stunning scenes of students and youth getting on the Soviet tanks. We have widespread conflicts, in Prague. The result of that is that the government of Dubček, who is the reformer in Czechoslovakia at the time, Dubček is asked to resign, and he plays no role in politics anymore after that. And in a nutshell, the Soviets find a communist regime, install new people in the communist regime of Czechoslovakia that are not trumpeting the need for reform and change. This is a powerful show of force and a show of, to put it in a pedestrian language, who is the boss in the region. Now, how do we assess the events of 1968? Before I get there, I really just one thing I'd like to point out. What I have linked in our learning material for this week is an excellent, a small piece with photographs and descriptions of the events in Prague in 1968 by a great Czechoslovak and Czech photographer, Josef Kudelka. Please take the trouble to see it. It's extremely interesting. Now, how do we assess the events of 1968? Again, as I said earlier, 1968 was the apex of a decade of youth radicalization, the so-called long 60s, and flourishing alternative cultures, countercultures. The experience of 1968 in Western and Eastern Europe was different. And here I would like you to bear in mind of the fact that the boundaries between Western and Eastern Europe in the 60s they're not only geopolitical, they're also intellectual boundaries. We have different cultural boundaries. We have different political boundaries. And nothing exemplifies that more than the idea that one of the students or one of the leaders of the student revolution revolts in 68 in Western Europe, when they go to see their, Czechoslovak counterparts, they can't really understand each other politically. This is extremely important to bear in mind, because the ideas of freedom that become that these movements propose in the West and the East, they're not similar. However, that's not to say that there are not many similarities. That, for instance, countercultures, as I mentioned earlier, different forms of expressing that these kinds of countercultures stay only in the west part of Europe. They do travel in the eastern part of Europe, and they do frame the resistance against the regimes. So, just to clarify this, it may be that the political aims of those students or youth who revolt in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe are different, but they do share a common cultural language. And we can see that in societies like the Czechoslovakia and elsewhere, even in Hungary, how rock music moves. Obviously, it's being not the socialist regimes don't really allow for specific kinds of music, so we have the kind of illegal transportation of cassettes, etc. Now, a third pointer is that in Western Europe, the radicalized youth look to the third world for anti-capitalist models to emulate. And while in Western Europe political pluralist democracy was targeted, in Eastern Europe student radicals fought for pluralist democracy. And here I will leave you with a couple of thoughts that we may discuss in the tutorial. Tony Judd, the historian of post-war Europe, argues that the 60s was a revolution of the intellectuals. Don't know what you think about that. This means that indeed there was a widespread discontent about working conditions and real wages, as we were at the peak of post-war growth in Western Europe, but we're also approaching the end of the peak. But predominantly, and maybe this explains why these revolts in the late 1968, this explains why the revolts were not really successful, aside from maybe challenging, old leaders like de Gaulle, is the fact that they were driven by, one would argue, by intellectual middle classes, especially in Western Europe, that really just wanted to express themselves freely. Just a counterpoint. In Eastern Europe, although 1968 did not undermine, by undermine I mean did not really, as it were, gave a decisive blow to communism and to the Soviet model, it nonetheless became a milestone in struggles against Soviet rule. And thereafter, the stories of dissidents, people, intellectuals, and others who fled from places like Czechoslovakia and elsewhere, did become more known, as it were, to the Western European public. So with that, I've come to the end of this lecture. I thank you for your attention, and I really look forward to our discussion in the tutorial.